The snow came quietly, but not before one man vanished. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community connect. Now, let's begin. It had been one of those Paris afternoons when the cold is not yet winter's cold, but something in the air makes you certain it is coming. From his office window, Maigret could see the faint smudge of cloud over the rooftops, low and heavy, promising snow before nightfall. The radiators in the Quai des Orfèvres were clanking in their unhurried way, as though they, too, felt no need to overexert themselves before the real freeze arrived. He sat at his desk, his chair tilted slightly back, not reading the papers spread before him, but holding his pipe in one hand, unlit, letting the stem rest between his teeth. The telephone on the corner of the desk had not rung in an hour. On the windowsill, someone had left a coffee cup, abandoned mid-morning, the skin on its surface curling. He could hear, distantly, the muffled rise and fall of voices from the corridor. Routine disputes about forms, signatures, deadlines. When the knock came, it was gentle, almost uncertain. Maigret lowered his gaze to the glass in the door, where a vague silhouette lingered before pushing it open. It was Lapointe, his young inspector, cheeks flushed from the cold. "You're not busy, Chief?" he asked. "That depends," Maigret said, his voice thick with the warmth of the room. Lapointe stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets. "There's something odd," he began. "A man was seen on Rue de Turenne this morning, just before 7. No one knows him. He was talking to the concierge at number 14, and then nothing." Maigret looked at him over the rim of his pipe. "People speak to concierge every morning. You'll have to do better. It's just, the concierge says he was nervous. Kept glancing over his shoulder, said he was waiting for someone, then left, and—" Lapointe hesitated. By 8 o'clock, the snow had started in that part of the city, but no one saw him again, no footprints going away from the building. The faintest smile touched Maigret's lips. Not amusement exactly, but a recognition of something just outside the ordinary. "No footprints," he repeated. Lapointe nodded, as though aware how thin it all sounded. "The concierge says she's sure of it, and there's talk already in the street. She says he might be the last person to have seen, well, something, before the snow fell." Maigret leaned back further, closing his eyes for a moment. It was nothing yet. Not officially. A man in a street, a conversation, then a change in the weather. But the image of that patch of pavement, whitened and clean, erasing the traces of where he had gone, settled in Maigret's mind like a seed waiting for the right soil. "Come back in an hour," he said at last, "and bring me her name." Lapointe, relieved to have been heard, gave a brisk nod and slipped out. When the door closed again, Maigret rose, crossed to the window, and stared at the slow-moving clouds. Somewhere over the city, snow was beginning to fall. Not here yet, but close. He lit his pipe, the first smoke of the afternoon curling toward the cold glass. Somewhere out there, a man had been seen for the last time before the world went white. Lapointe returned before the hour had quite run its course, a briskness in his step that might have been eagerness or simply the draught from the corridor. He didn't sit. He held a thin slip of paper as if it was something delicate that might crumple under the wrong gaze. "Her name is Madame Hélène Prévost," he said. "Concierge at number 14, Rue de Turenne. 61 by her account. Widowed 10 years. Lives on the ground floor, loge to the right as you enter." Maigret nodded and reached for his coat without saying he would go. The gesture was enough. He let Lapointe help him into the sleeves, which always seemed to have shrunk between one day and the next. The pipe went in his pocket. He took his hat from the peg and glanced at the window. The sky had settled into the color of dirty wool, and a few pale specks had begun to mark the glass. By the time they crossed the courtyard and reached the street, it was snowing in earnest, not yet the kind that clings, but a steady sift that made people hunch their shoulders and tuck their chins farther into scarves. On the river, the wind sharpened. They took the car, and Maigret let Lapointe drive. He watched the city move sideways through the window, bookstores shuttered early, a girl in a red beret running with both hands on the brim, a dog shaking its paws after each step like a man trying to rid himself of a thought. He said nothing. The snow had a way of softening the city's noises until they seemed to come from far away. Even the horn of a delivery van sounded like something remembered. In the Marais, Rue de Turenne lay in a line of stone facades that had learned over centuries how to be indifferent. Number 14 had a wooden door with a fan light, the paint worn to the grain where people pushed. Someone had pasted a notice about chimney sweeps near the bell plate, and beneath it the names were in a soldierly line, though one of them had been scratched out carefully with a knife and written again on paper, pinned with a tack. A pair of footprints came to the threshold and stopped. There were none going away. The snow on the pavement was thin, more like a suggestion than a layer, but enough to make edges look kinder. Inside, the hallway smelled of cabbage and old soap. The loge was as Lapointe had promised, to the right, a glass pane with lace at the corners and the sort of curtain that tries to be cheerful without the material for it. Maigret took off his hat and knocked with the knuckle of his forefinger. He didn't look at Lapointe, and the young inspector, understanding that silence was part of the introduction, made himself smaller. Madame Prévost opened the door on the chain first, peering at them with a sharpness that came from habit rather than suspicion. When she saw the hat, the coat, the face, she unlatched the chain and stood aside. She wore a cardigan fastened with safety pins where buttons had given up, and her hair, grey and stiff, was gathered in a comb that kept losing the battle. "I'm not saying it's a crime," she began as if the conversation had been going on without them, "but it's odd. One knows when a thing is odd." "Of course," Maigret said. He eased himself onto the wooden chair she pushed toward him, a chair polished by the years to a dull shine. The loggia was warm with a stove that ticked to itself. A saucepan sat on its lip, and a spoon rested beside it, leaving a damp ring on the enamel. On the table were keys hung on hooks, each with a number painted in white. A pair of rubber overshoes hid under the bench like small animals. On a shelf, a black old-fashioned phone with a cloth cord. "You were out in the street at that hour?" he asked, without preface. His voice was as much warmth as sound. "I'd gone to clear the step," she said, almost offended he could imagine anything else. "There was no snow yet then, only the damp that creeps between tiles and makes people slip. The baker boy comes early. Maurice, he's called, and he never wipes his feet. They carry in the filth with their bread nowadays." "And he was speaking to you?" Maigret let his eyes travel to the cloth covering the stool, the way a thread dangled and kept its own counsel. "He asked for a name," she said. "He had a paper in his hand. I could see writing, but not the words. He kept folding the paper and unfolding it. He read it 3 times, with his lips, you know, and he asked if I knew a Mademoiselle Huret. 3rd floor, left." "And do you?" Maigret asked. Lapointe shifted his weight slightly. The floorboards complained and then resigned themselves again to being a floor. "Everyone knows everyone," Madame Prévost said, a little proud, a little tired. "Mademoiselle Huret has been there 6 months, very quiet. She's a seamstress. Curtains mostly and hems. I said yes and pointed up. He didn't go, he was—" She made a small gesture with her hand, like a bird testing air with its wing. "He was listening, to the stair, perhaps, or to himself." "What sort of man?" Maigret said, and took his pipe from his pocket without lighting it. The feel of it in his hand had the familiarity of a dog lying across your feet. "You know," she said, and realized at once he couldn't. "Not young, not old either. 40, maybe." His eyes were pale. "You don't expect that. He had a coat that was good enough but not new. The cuffs had been brushed, a hat with a tired brim, and the shoes. She frowned, looking down at her own. They were polished too much, for morning, I mean, or for someone walking who doesn't know where he's going. And what did he say, exactly? The word exactly was not a demand. It was an invitation to remember. He said, "Is she in?" No bonjour, not even that. Men forget the bonjour when they don't know if they'll be welcomed. I told him at that hour she would be in. She keeps to herself, but she is sober. He looked at his paper again, and then up the stair, as if it could answer him, and then at the street. The street? Lapointe asked, but the question was really Maigret's, and he let it stand. He was waiting for someone, she said with satisfaction, as though yielding a conclusion after a fair price. He kept glancing toward the corner where the tobacconist is. You can see it from the door when the glass isn't fogged. A woman came by with a child. They were early for school. He stepped back to let them through without thinking. You can tell a man's head from his feet, Chief Inspector. His feet moved out of kindness before his face knew what it was doing. What time was this? Maigret asked. I'd finished my first sweep. The church on the next street had just rung the half hour, she said. 7:30. The snow began some time after that. And he went up? Maigret asked. That's the thing, she said. He didn't. He said, I'll come back, like someone speaking to the air. And he walked toward the tobacconist. He had that way some men walk when they're trying to make their shoulders smaller. You saw him again? Lapointe asked. No, she said. And for the first time her voice showed uncertainty. That is, I didn't see him go away. I went back to my stove. An old woman's bones know when water is about to boil. When I came out again, the snow had begun. There were no footprints, not the kind that start and stop. There were only the ones toward the door. After that, nothing. The street had been brushed by God. Maigret listened to the stove tick. He could hear a faint tapping from the stairwell, water in a pipe somewhere, or a neighbor beating dust from a cloth on a sill. He looked at the hooks of keys again. Number 13's was missing. He didn't comment. He let his gaze settle on a photograph in a frame with peeling gilt. A man in a uniform who might have been a husband before he became a photograph. He set the pipe on the table and folded his hands over his belly as if warming them over a thought. Would Mademoiselle Huret be up? He asked. She doesn't go out until afternoon, Madame Prévost said. She works late. The needle is a night creature. She gave a small laugh without amusement. She had a visit 3 evenings ago. A sister, she said. But I've lived with sisters, and that woman had none of the sister in her. She wore a perfume that arrives at a place before she does. Dark. Hair? Lapointe said, too quickly. Fair, said the concierge, taking a little pleasure in correcting him. A pretty coat that had been mended at the hem by a hand better than the one that cut it. She left looking pleased with herself, which is not the way sisters leave after 6 months apart. Maigret stood. It was not a decision but a change of posture. He thanked Madame Prévost with a nod that would become the memory she told her neighbors later. At the door of the loge, he paused. The name that was scratched off downstairs, he said. Who was it? 3rd floor, right, she said after a moment in which her face composed itself into neutrality and then lost the battle. Monsieur Lachaume. He left last week without saying goodbye. He posted his new address on paper and took his name with him, as if he could take the walls as well. Outside in the stairwell, the air was cooler, a draught from somewhere turning the odor of cabbage into something thinner. The steps were stone, worn in the middle to shallow basins. On the first landing, a bicycle leaned against the banister, its bell dented, a single glove laid over the handlebars as if someone had left a hand and would be back for it. Maigret ran his hand along the rail. It felt like a spine. They climbed in silence. From a door came the sound of a radio playing a dance tune at the wrong hour, small and apologetic. At the 2nd floor, a door opened a crack and shut again, the way a man remembers he has forgotten something and chooses to go on, forgetting it. At the 3rd floor, Left, the name Huret was written in a careful feminine hand on a card tucked under the glass. Maigret didn't knock immediately. He listened. There is always a sound a little different from silence if someone stands on the other side holding breath. He heard the hum of a sewing machine somewhere else in the building, the thread singing against a metal throat. He heard a cough, though not from behind this door. When he knocked, once, then again after a pause, there was movement. Not the quick steps of someone surprised, but a chair being drawn back from a table and then placed against it again, as if she had changed her mind about who she was. The door opened on the chain first, as downstairs. A young woman with the blunt look of those who work with small things met his eyes without greeting. She had pinned her hair back in the style that keeps it from falling into the work, and a tape measure hung around her neck like a priest's stole. Her eyes went at once to the hat, the coat, then to La Pointe, then back to the older man whose presence filled the doorway as if he had always been part of it. "Mademoiselle Huret," he said, almost a question and almost an apology. "Yes," she said, and the chain came off. She stepped back, and they entered a room that smelled of starch and iron. On the little iron stove a kettle grumbled. A dress form stood near the window, already wearing half a dress, that looked as if it were trying to decide between two lives. On the table, spools of thread, a pincushion in the shape of a tomato, a pair of shears with the nick in the blade that every pair of shears earns in time. There were 2 cups beside the kettle, one clean, one with a brown circle at the bottom that had dried into a map. "We're disturbing you," Maigret said, and made it sound like a confession of his own. "It's snowing," she said, as if that explained the presence of strangers everywhere. She stood with her hands together, not folded, simply making a small church of fingers. "Is it about the man?" "What man?" La Pointe asked, but Maigret's glance stopped him from pressing. He turned to the window and watched snow try to write on the glass. "The one who spoke to Madame Prévost this morning," she said, and her attempt at indifference was so honest it gave itself away. "She told me when I went down for water. She said he asked for me. She enjoys my name on other people's tongues." "Do you know him?" Maigret asked. He did not move into the room. He remained within the first step of entry, a guest who might leave unchanged by anything he saw. "No," she said too carefully. "That is to say, I know many men who bring torn hems and ill-cut sleeves. They all look the same when they want something mended." He did not come up. "You were at home," Maigret said. "I'm always at home at 7 in the morning," she said. "There is nowhere else to be. I begin at 9. People like to find a dress ready when they discover they have somewhere to go." "The kettle is boiling," he observed gently, though it was not. She turned, grateful for a reason to escape the conversation, and lifted it anyway, pouring water that had not yet found the courage to be steam. She added a spoon of leaves to a pot, and then remembered there were 2 cups on the table. "You're expecting someone," Maigret said, the words not a question. "Only the day," she said, and smiled with an effort that left the corners of her mouth unpersuaded. She set out 1 cup, then, perhaps on impulse, a second. Her hands were steady until they were not. A pin had nicked her thumb earlier. A dark dot, no larger than a sesame seed, marked the pad. She noticed his glance and tucked her hand into her sleeve as if the pin were a shame. "You had a visitor 3 evenings ago," he said, and the line of her shoulders changed. "A sister," Madame Prévost thought. "People hear words and stop there," she said. "It was a woman who brings me work from a client, that's all. She wears too much perfume. She thinks it makes her invisible." "And the client?" Maigret asked. "Men who pay for a certain discretion," she said, and for the first time looked at him with a weight that suggested she wished him to be a kind of man he was not. "I sew curtains that keep out eyes. If I say their names, the curtains will not work. There was a man this morning," he said softly, as if telling her something he had just remembered. He had polished shoes for someone who did not yet have a place to go. He asked for you. He did not come up. When the snow began, there were no footprints to show where he went. He was the last man seen before the snow fell. She put the cup down. It clicked against the saucer. Outside, a bus passed, leaving a longer silence in its wake than its noise deserved. Her eyes went to the dress form, to the hem pinned and waiting, to the kettle, to the window where the world was becoming less precise. "I didn't see him," she said. "If I had, I would tell you whether I knew his face." Maigret nodded. He believed her and did not believe her. Both were possible without contradiction. He looked once more at the second cup. It was placed where a person would sit to watch the snow. He noticed a coat thrown over the chair back, a man's scarf draped there as if it had been used and then forgotten. He did not mention it. The scarf might be a length of wool kept for darning, or it might be the memory of someone who had left without his neck being cold. "We won't take more of your time," he said. He stepped back into the doorway and became again a man who visited places without inhabiting them. "If the man returns, you will tell Madame Prévost to ring me, or you might ring yourself. The number is in the book." She nodded and followed them to the threshold, where she paused as though to say something, and then did not. In the stairwell the air felt sharper, and the window on the landing had begun to gather a lace of ice at the edges, more delicate than anything a needle could make. On the way down, Maigret stopped at the second-floor landing and looked through the milky glass at the courtyard, where Snow was writing in small characters only the morning would be able to read. He said nothing to Lapointe. At the door, Madame Prévost had come out again, her cardigan pulled tight, the safety pins bright as teeth. She looked at Maigret expectantly, as if he would bring news from her own building that she had somehow missed. "Tell me something," he said. "At 7:30, the tobacconist on the corner. Was he open?" "He is open before anyone," she said. "He believes people need their tobacco before they need bread. He says it shows him who they are." "And was there anyone there?" Maigret asked. "The postman," she said. "Always too cheerful for a man who brings bills. A girl with a parcel. A man who buys the morning paper and doesn't read it until evening so he can say he has had it all day." "Did any of them come in here?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "No," she said. "Only the snow came in, on the soles of the baker boy." She paused. "And a little later, a gentleman with a cough came to ask for Monsieur Lachaume's new address. I told him I had not been authorized to give it. He smiled as if the refusal was the answer he had expected." "What sort of cough?" Lapointe asked, half to tease the precision. "The sort men do into their fist when they don't want you to count how many times," she said, offended and accurate. "A dry one." "Thank you," Maigret said. He looked once more at the footprints that came to the door and ended. The snow had deepened a fraction while they had been upstairs. Already the earlier marks were blurring at the edges, as if the city preferred its secrets with softened outlines. Back in the car, he didn't tell Lapointe to start the engine at once. The windshield was a white page. He watched the doorway to number 14 without knowing precisely what he was watching for. A man crossed the street with his collar turned up and the resigned shuffle of someone who had learned that winter laws apply to everyone. A boy dragged a sled with no snow enough to justify it, hoping the sky would make him right. At the tobacconist, a woman bent her head against the wind and came away with a packet of something hidden in her glove. "What do you think, Chief?" Lapointe asked at last, not impatient, only reminding the air it could be used for speaking. "That he asked for her and did not go up," Maigret said, "and that someone else asked for a man who had already left. Between the two is a thread. It doesn't look strong. It doesn't need to be." He lit his pipe and let the match go out of its own accord. The smoke sat in the car as if reluctant to step back into the cold. "We will speak to the tobacconist," he said finally, and then to the postman who was cheerful. Cheerful men talk twice as much as others, and they remember half. Lapointe smiled without showing teeth and started the engine. The wipers began their slow, resigned arc. clearing a narrow world in which the street, the door at number 14, and the corner shop existed with the clarity of things that are about to mean more than they do now. The car edged forward into the falling white, and the city, quiet under the first true snow, yielded a little, as if making a path not just for wheels, but for a thought that had decided, at last, to go somewhere. The tobacconist's shop on the corner was one of those narrow premises that seemed to have been there before the street knew what it wanted to be. The windows were half-steamed, displaying packets of cigarettes with faded corners and boxes of matches in little pyramids. A bell above the door gave a tired ring when Lapointe pushed it open, letting in a gust of air and the smell of snow melting on coats. Inside, the light was yellowed, the floor worn to the grain in front of the counter. The man behind it was thin and angular, his collar buttoned up though the shop was warm, a scarf looped once round his neck as if it had been forgotten there. He glanced at them over the rim of his spectacles, then back to the paper he was folding for a customer. "You're open? Early," Maigret said, in a tone that was neither question nor compliment. "If I weren't," the tobacconist replied without looking up, "the same people would stand outside and blame me for their hands being cold." The customer, a woman with a scarf knotted under her chin, took her packet of Gauloises and gave Maigret a brief, assessing look before stepping out into the snow. The bell rang again, softer this time. Maigret moved closer to the counter, letting the quiet settle around them. "This morning, around 7:30, you might have seen a man standing outside number 14, he said. The tobacconist adjusted his spectacles, buying himself a few seconds. "I see many men standing on this street. Some are waiting for someone, some are waiting for themselves. This one," Maigret said, "looked towards you more than once. Pale eyes, a coat that had been brushed at the cuffs, shoes well polished." "That one," the tobacconist said after a pause, "bought nothing. Stood under my awning for a minute, maybe two, as if the snow might change its mind. He had a paper in his hand, folded, then unfolded. I thought he would come in, but he didn't. He watched a girl and a child go past, and then he turned his head sharply, like someone hearing a door open behind him, though there was no one there." "He didn't speak to you?" Maigret asked. "Only with his eyes," the man said. "The way you ask a question without wanting the answer." Lapointe shifted beside him. "Which direction did he go?" The tobacconist gave a small shrug. "I turned to serve someone. When I looked again, he wasn't there. I thought he'd gone into number 14. The snow started soon after. By the time I stepped outside to sweep it from the step, the street was empty. No tracks except yours truly and the postman." "And the postman?" Maigret asked. "He came in for his usual packet of caporal, whistling, always the same tune. Something he must have learned in the army. He likes to think it makes him memorable." "Did you see him speak to the man?" The tobacconist shook his head. "Number, but if they had known each other, it would have been in the way men greet without words. A nod, maybe. And I saw no nod." Maigret thanked him with a slight tilt of the head and stepped back into the snow. The flakes had grown larger, slower, the kind that decide where they want to land before they fall. Across the street, number 14 looked unchanged, but Maigret noticed the faint gleam of wet on the doorframe where someone's hand had rested recently. They waited near the car until the postman appeared at the far end of the street, his bag slung low, his cap dusted with white. He spotted them at once, or perhaps just the shape of Maigret's coat, and slowed, though his whistle did not break. "Cold morning for standing still, Chief Inspector," he said cheerfully. "And yet you make it look like a stroll in May." Maigret replied. The postman grinned, teeth white against the red of his ears. "One keeps moving, one keeps warm. Stops are for doorways and signatures. This morning, before the snow, you saw a man outside number 14. I see many men outside many doors," the postman said lightly, but the grin had tightened a fraction. "Yes, pale-eyed fellow, Looked like he'd been walking without getting anywhere. We didn't speak. I had letters for the second floor there and no reason to loiter. Which flat? He thought for a moment. 2 for a Madame Duroc. No relation to your business, I suppose. And 1 for a Mademoiselle Huret. Maigret's pipe stayed in his pocket, but his hand found the familiar shape. You noticed nothing else? No one else watching him? The postman tilted his head. Now that you mention it. As I came out, there was a man on the opposite pavement. Hat pulled low, collar up. I couldn't have told you his eyes. He was studying the pale-eyed one, though. Not like they knew each other. More like he was trying to decide whether to approach. And did he? I turned the corner, the postman said. If he did after that, I didn't see. Snow was already coming down by then. You know how it is. You get busy keeping the envelopes dry. Maigret thanked him and watched him move away, whistling again, the tune curling into the whiteness like smoke. Back in the car, Lapointe turned to him. 2 men then, one asking for Huret, one watching him, and neither of them there when the snow stopped the clocks. Maigret nodded without speaking. His gaze was on the street, but not in the way of looking for movement. More as if he were weighing the air for something that might still be floating in it. We'll need Lachaume's new address, he said finally. But not yet. First, we see who comes and goes from here now. They sat, the engine idling, as the street thickened under the snowfall. A delivery van stopped briefly at the bakery 2 doors down, the driver leaving the door open while he carried in a crate of flour. A woman emerged from number 14 with a bucket, throwing grey water onto the gutter where it steamed faintly before freezing. No sign of the pale-eyed man, nor of the watcher with the low hat. After 20 minutes, Maigret stepped out again. The snow was deeper now, muting even the sound of passing wheels. He crossed to the shop on the next corner, one of those small groceries where the scent of oranges fought with the damp of vegetables in wooden crates. Inside, the grocer looked up from slicing cheese. "Inspector, we don't see you in this quartier often." Maigret took off his hat, shook the snow from it. "You have a good view of the tobacconist from here. This morning you might have noticed a man waiting outside." The grocer wiped his hands on his apron. "I noticed 2, actually. One under the tobacconist's awning, kept folding a paper like he wanted to, make it smaller. And another across the way, standing by the lamp post. That one didn't move except when the first man looked his way. Then he bent as if to tie his shoe, though I doubt there was a lace to it. Did they speak? Not while I watched. But you can tell when 2 people are linked by something they'd rather not show." He leaned a little closer. "The second man, the one with the lamp post, came into my shop later, bought nothing, asked if I'd seen where the pale-eyed one had gone. I told him I hadn't." "What did he do then?" "Smiled as though I'd given him the answer he expected," the grocer said, "and left." Maigret thanked him and stepped back into the muffled street. Lapointe was leaning against the car, hands in pockets, snow collecting on his shoulders. "They're connected," Lapointe said, "but they don't want to be seen together." "Or one doesn't want to be seen by the other," Maigret said. "It's not always mutual." He glanced once more at number 14, its door closed, lace curtains unmoved. Somewhere inside, Mademoiselle Huret might be working again at her sewing machine, the hem on the dress form waiting for a hand steady enough to finish it. The scarf on her chair had not been moved when they left. He wondered if it was still there. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll return earlier, before the snow can cover the street." They drove away slowly, tires whispering in the whiteness. The river, when they passed it, was a slate strip between 2 banks dusted like pastry. The lamps along the quay glowed through the flurries, each one surrounded by a faint halo. Maigret leaned back, pipe unlit, letting the city move past without hurry, the morning's conversations folding into one another like the creases of a paper someone could not stop turning in his hands. Would you like me to continue directly into Section 4, where Maigret returns the next morning and observes the building's life before anyone notices he's there? That's where the thread could begin to tighten. The next morning, the city woke under a thin crust that pretended to be more than it was. The snow had stopped in the night, and the pavements had the grey, granular look of something that had been handled too much. Maigret left his building earlier than a man of his age had any urge to, pulling the door shut quietly so as not to wake a neighbor who did not sleep well. He walked to the quay and let the river's breath meet his own, cold on cold, before turning into the streets that would lead him back to the Marais. He did not take the car. He preferred the feeling of arriving the way the morning did, without noise. A cafe opposite number 14 had opened its shutters while the sky was still the color of dishwater. Inside, the zinc counter shone with the sort of cleanliness that belongs to the beginning of a day and rarely survives it. The waiter, with sleeves rolled past his wrists, set down a coffee and a calvados without being asked, as if something in Maigret's hat brim had ordered for him. He drank slowly, facing the window, which had been wiped into a rectangle of clearer glass, with a cloth that left faint arcs at the edges. He could see the door to number 14, the tobacconist's awning, and the lamp-post where the grocer had noticed a man bending to tie a non-existent lace. At 7, Madame Prévost came out with her broom, her cardigan buttoned wrong, which meant she dressed in a hurry in the dark. She swept with that resigned vigor of someone keeping a bargain with herself. The baker boy arrived, yawning into his scarf, and she scolded him, and he nodded, depositing snow and flour in equal measures onto her newly cleared step. The tobacconist rattled open his half-shutter and stood for a moment under his awning, eyeing the street as if the day might have changed its mind about being a day after all. Across the way a window opened, and a hand, only the hand, reached out to shake a small rug. Whoever was attached to it had decided the cold was an acceptable price for clean. The postman's whistle came before the postman himself, a few bars escaping from behind the corner like scouts sent ahead to see if conditions were favorable. He walked with his bag high against his hip today, wary of slush. He glanced once toward the cafe and, recognizing the shape at the window, made his whistle softer, like a secret he was sharing only with himself. He went into number 14 and was not long inside. When he emerged, he had no letters left in his hand. He crossed to the tobacconist, where the bell tinkled, and then on, the tune picking up again as if the stop had only been a breath. Maigret thought of cheerful men remembering half and talking twice. He did not yet need half, the man had forgotten. At past, the first sign of what he had come for, a figure at the lamp-post, hat brim low, collar up. Even at this distance, through the cafe glass and the breath on it, Maigret recognized something he had expected without naming it. The man had the posture of someone who had been cold often enough to know exactly where to put his hands, so they would do him the most good. He coughed into his fist, twice, then once more as if giving in to a habit he had promised to break. He looked not at number 14, but at the tobacconist's door, then at the pavement where yesterday's footprints had ended by beginning. He did not move when a bus went past, though the wind it carried tugged at his coat. He was a man who let things happen around him the way a stone lets water go by. At 7:40, a woman approached from the direction of the boulevard, walking quickly and without effort, her heels making a sound the snow had no business permitting. She wore the perfume that arrives before its owner, not because it is strong, but because it is certain of its own path. Fair hair under a hat the color of cream, a coat whose hem had been mended by a hand that respected the original seam. She passed the lamp-post without turning her head. The coughing man looked down. His hand went to his pocket, and then away again, as if a gesture had changed its mind. She entered number 14, and the door's glass wobbled briefly in its frame. Maigret paid and went out. The air had that tasted metal feel that comes with the second day of snow. He did not go to the door at once. He crossed instead to the lamp-post and stood near the man without standing with him. For a moment, they were two men looking at the same street for different reasons. The man's eyes flicked, not to Maigret's face, but to the pipe in the older man's pocket, then to his shoes, then away. It was the inventory of someone who had been taught to take in details and forget they were details. "Cold for waiting," Maigret said, as if making common cause with the weather. "I'm warming a place for someone who's late," the man replied without humor. His voice carried the rasp of last winter's bronchitis. He coughed again, the fist a small shelter for the sound. Maigret nodded toward the door. "You'll miss her if you prefer the lamp post." The man didn't ask which her was being referred to. "She knows where to find me," he said, and the lie in the sentence lay not in the words, but in their ease. They stood like that a minute longer. The tobacconist watched them without trying to look as though he was. Somewhere behind a shutter, a radio began a news bulletin and then faltered into static. A cat made a short, irritable complaint at the cold and disappeared under a parked van. "Your cough is worse today," Maigret said. "The air's sharp," the man answered. "It's honest air." "Honest air is rare in Paris," Maigret said, and the man's mouth admitted the beginning of a smile, then refused to become one. "I've no business with you, Chief Inspector," he said, still not looking at him. "And yet you asked for Monsieur Lachaume's new address yesterday," Maigret said, "from the concierge who never gives what she isn't authorized to." The man's shoulders did something with the weight they carried. Not a start, a shift. "One asks," he said. "People like to refuse." He took something from his pocket and put it in his mouth. It was not a cigarette. He chewed with an absent motion of the jaw. "Eucalyptus. Pastilles a man buys when he doesn't intend to see a doctor." "Is it because of Mademoiselle Huret that you're here?" Maigret said, almost kind. "Or because of the man with the polished shoes?" This time the eyes came up, pale under the brim's shade. Not pale like the other man's had been. Pale the way some men's eyes are after they've learned to work in interest rates and regrets. "I haven't seen any polished shoes," he said. "I look at the ground only when it tells me to." "Then it will tell you there's a service passage behind number 14, Maigret said. "If a man did not wish to leave by the front door, and if the snow wanted to be kind to him." The other man did not answer. He turned, not abruptly, and let himself drift down the pavement as if asked politely to move along by an invisible hand. He did not go far. He stood by the mouth of the alley that ran beside the building, pretending to examine a notice about coal deliveries that would not be resumed until spring. A man can pretend to read without being literate, but he cannot pretend to be interested in more than 5 lines of a notice about coal. Maigret left him to it and went to the door. Inside, the hallway smelled as yesterday, but the cabbage had been replaced by a cleaner cabbage. Madame Prévost's broom was propped against the wall. She herself was in the loge, carefully drying the keys on their hooks with a cloth so thin it was more memory than material. "You're early," she said, not hiding the pleasure this gave her. "Earlier men than I've already come," he said, a woman with a perfume ahead of her. "She goes upstairs like a cat," Madame Prévost said, grudging admiration in her voice. "No noise, no drafts. She has her own key now. I did not give it, but the locks tell their stories to hands." "Service passage," Maigret said. "Where does it lead?" "To the courtyard at number 12, and then to the lane," she said, as if he had asked where the wind went when it left the window. "It has 2 doors. One sticks, the other obeys." "It is kept locked?" She looked at the hooks again. Number 13's nail still bare. "When keys are returned," she said. "Who has it now?" "No one who should," she said, and then caught her own words with the tips of her teeth. Monsieur Lachaume never gave it back. Men leave as if they are closing a book, but they tear a page. "Did you tell the man who coughed this?" Maigret asked. "I told him nothing and enjoyed it," she said, a satisfaction that made her look younger by a year. He smiled as if I had told him all. Maigret left her without comment, took the corridor that smelled of damp paper and old firewood, and pushed at the door she had called obedient. It was the sort of door that resented being used and announced it with a small groan. Beyond, the passage narrowed and then widened into a courtyard where the snow had been trampled by feet that belonged to another building. On the far side, a door with peeling paint had the scratch marks of a key that had missed its hole more often than it found it. Near the sill, there was a scuff in the grey sludge that told him nothing in the way some scuffs tell everything. It had been made by a shoe stopping and then changing its mind in a hurry. Beside it, a cigarette end flattened under a heel. Caporal. Not the tobacconist's brand alone, but a habit men of a certain generation had kept when fashions changed. He stood a moment, listening. Sounds from other lives came over the walls. Kettle put down too firmly. Laughter stopped quickly, the small, hard knock of a bottle against a glass. When he turned back toward the corridor, he saw at the end of it, through the oblong of light that was the hall, a man's shadow hesitate and then withdraw, as if it had been asked to wait somewhere more comfortable. The cough, when it came, was exactly as Madame Prévost had described it. Counted, contained. On the stairs, he met the perfume coming down before its owner. The woman had the same composed face as the evening visitor described by the concierge. She paused to let him pass, then decided not to. "Inspector," she said, as if tasting the word, "if you are looking for Mademoiselle Hure, she's working." "Everyone is," he said. "It is only the jobs that differ." She smiled with half her face. "She has an order to finish today, a very urgent window that must not be looked through. You know how people are about their privacy. They need to be seen, not being seen." "You bring her work," he said, "and let the sentence become a question by not ending it." "I bring what she is clever enough to do," she said. "There are not many so steady with a hem." "And you take what is brought to you," he said, almost friendly. "And someone pays with money that is patient and does not ask to be thanked." "Money is the polite part of a transaction," she said. "Only poor people talk about it." She glanced past him at the corridor. "The back way is for tradesmen, Inspector. I'm a client." He let her pass. On the second-floor landing, he stopped, not to think, but to acknowledge what he already knew needed no thinking, that the polished shoes man had been meant to go up and had not, that the cough had been meant to follow and had not, that the back passage was not so much a secret as a convenience for those who preferred to keep their comings and goings from the daily bookkeeping of eyes. The kind of building that had learned over centuries to be indifferent was also the kind that knew how to be discreet. He did not go to Hurette's door. He went down and out and stood again near the lamp-post. The coughing man was where he had been, the way a magnet remembers its preferred filings. "Number 12's courtyard is less attractive than this pavement," Maigret said without preface. "But it has one advantage." The man looked at him carefully. "You've taken a walk," he said. "I like to know which doors are obedient and which are not," Maigret said. The other man's jaw worked once around the eucalyptus. "You also like to know why a man asks for an address that is none of his business." "La Chaume," Maigret said, laying the name down as a coin whose value he was not bargaining. "If you find him, give him my regards. Tell him not to waste a good winter on poor reasons." "Do you know him?" the man asked, as if the answer might hinder him more than help. "I know the place's men. Leave their names," Maigret said. "And I know when a man leaves one too neatly behind." He turned away without offering a card. At the cafe, he asked to use the telephone and dialed his own number, listening to the ring that had the rhythm of his own stairwell in it. Madame Maigret answered with the same calm she used for early calls. He told her he had already had a coffee and a calvados, and she said that would not prevent him from needing lunch. Then, in the tone reserved for telling him when a scarf needed brushing, she remarked that men who polish their shoes too much early in the morning are either on their way to apologize or to be forgiven. He thanked her for the weather and hung up. Back on the street, he felt the thread between the three names, Hurette, La Chaume, the man whose shoes had been too carefully shined, tighten a notch, as if someone somewhere had given it a small, almost absent-minded tug. He walked once more past number 14 and looked up at the third floor. A curtain moved, then became again the sort of curtain that moves only when a window is opened. The coughing man had drifted to the mouth of the alley and was standing where a person might be if he did not wish to be asked why he was there. The tobacconist arranged his pyramids of matches again, for the second time that morning, the way men assert control when there is none to be had. "We'll go to the file room," Maigret said when Lapointe arrived, breath making steam, cheeks stung red by the air. "We'll see where Monsieur Lachaume took his name, then we'll decide whether to follow the cough or the perfume." Lapointe glanced at the lamp-post and then at the door of number 14. "And if the polished shoes return?" "They will be easier to see on dirty snow," Maigret said. "People become clearer when they are trying to be careful." He put his pipe back into his pocket without lighting it. It had served its purpose this morning, not as smoke, but as the weight in a hand that gathers patience. He felt the day settling into its shape, not the shape of revelation, but the shape of the sort of understanding that creeps up through the soles of your shoes until it reaches the head. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The city would keep its pace, the people would keep theirs. He would be there when the two met. The file room at the Quai des Orfèvres was still waking when they arrived, its smell of paper and polish mingling with the faint, unhurried warmth from the radiators. A clerk with ink under his nails looked up from his desk, his face half in shadow from the high windows. He knew better than to ask why Maigret wanted something. He simply waited for the name. "Lachaume, third floor. Right, number 14, Rue de Turenne." "Left last week," Maigret said. His voice was flat, as if listing the ingredients of a recipe. The clerk disappeared into the rows of steel cabinets, the faint clack of drawer handles punctuating the quiet. Maigret stood, with his coat still on, pipe in his hand unlit, eyes on the frosted glass of the inner door. He could see blurred silhouettes passing now and then, men with cases to close, errands to run, none of them thinking about a man whose name had been peeled from a bell plate. When the clerk returned, he carried a slim folder, its corners softened by use. He set it on the desk without ceremony. "Victor Lachaume," he said. 42, no criminal record. Former accountant for a textiles firm, the kind that folds with the first bad season. Moved into Rue de Turenne a year ago, left for an address in Ivry-sur-Seine. No forwarding phone number. Maigret flipped the folder open. The photograph stapled to the corner showed a man whose features seemed reluctant to form a single expression. The sort of face that might smile at you without meaning it, and then forget it had done so. The handwriting on his registration card was neat, but in a style that belonged to someone else's schoolroom. The pen strokes careful in a way that suggested practice rather than habit. "Any visitors registered?" Maigret asked without looking up. The clerk shook his head. "Not officially, but the concierge reported a female friend on several evenings. No name given." Maigret closed the folder and tapped it lightly against his palm. The texture of the card inside reminded him of the paper the pale-eyed man had been folding and unfolding in the street. They left the quay and drove east. The snow in Ivry was dirtier, thinner, city snow that had worked too hard for too long. The streets here carried the smell of the river when it was in a bad mood, and the buildings had none of the indifference of the Marais. They looked at you directly, as if they knew you might not be back. The address was a narrow house set back from the street, its shutters drawn though it was past 9. The doorbell had a button that stuck, so you had to press it twice to be sure. No one answered. Maigret pressed again, then stepped back, his eyes going to the windows above. The curtains there were uneven, one drawn fully, the other half open as though a hand had hesitated. He had the impression of someone inside standing just beyond the frame, measuring the decision to be seen. He lit his pipe and waited. After a moment, the door opened the width of a chain, and a woman's voice, low, wary, asked what they wanted. "Victor Lachaume," Maigret said. "He's not here." she answered too quickly. When do you expect him? The pause was longer than it needed to be. I don't know. He left. Left you or left here? Maigret asked, keeping his tone the same. Her eyes flickered at the distinction, though he could barely see her face through the gap. He said he'd be back, she murmured. Maigret stepped closer, the smoke from his pipe curling toward the opening. And if a man with pale eyes and polished shoes came looking for him, what would you tell? Him? For a moment, there was nothing, and then the chain slid back. She was younger than her voice had suggested, with hair pulled back too tightly and a cardigan buttoned wrong, just as Madame Prévost's had been. I'd tell him I don't know where Victor is, she said, because that's the truth. But I'd also tell him to stop asking. Victor doesn't like being found. Yet someone asked for him yesterday, Maigret said. A man who coughs into his fist. He was not the one with the polished shoes? Her lips pressed together, a thought trying not to be spoken. That one came here too, she said finally. Not yesterday. Before the snow. He asked if Victor owed me money. I said no. He smiled and said, Then you're luckier than most. Maigret glanced past her into the hall. A coat hung on the rack, its pockets sagging under their own contents. A pair of shoes by the wall had been wiped but not polished, the sort of carelessness of someone who never expected to be examined. You haven't seen Victor since when? A week ago. He left in the evening, said he'd be gone a few days. No suitcase, just the coat on his back and a scarf I'd never seen before. Dark, with a stripe, looked expensive but not his. Maigret thought of the scarf on Hurette's chair. If he comes back, he said, tell him I'd like to speak to him before the man with the cough does. Her mouth twitched at that, a shadow of a smile that wasn't for amusement. If he comes back, I'll tell him he should have left before the snow. They left her standing in the doorway, the chain back in place. Lapointe glanced sideways as they walked to the car. The scarf, Chief. Same one. Possibly, Maigret said. Possibly it's twin. In certain circles, twins like that are bought in pairs for reasons that have nothing to do with warmth. The drive back to the Marais was slower. Traffic had thickened and the streets were slick where the thaw had begun. Maigret said little. His eyes followed the patterns the snowmelt made along the gutters, breaking and reforming into small streams, carrying dirt and scraps of paper. It reminded him of a case long ago, where the clue had not been in what was present, but in what the rain had carried away. When they reached Rue de Turenne, the street had a different life from the mornings. Shopkeepers in their aprons at doorways, a boy dragging a sledge with only the memory of snow on it, Madame Prévost standing in her loge with her arms folded, watching the world pass as if she owned the view. The coughing man was gone. The lamp-post stood alone, its base ringed with a thawing fringe. The tobacconist nodded from his counter but did not come out. They went up to Hurette's flat without announcing themselves from below. The door was closed but not fully latched. Maigret knocked once, then pushed it open. She was at her sewing machine, the rhythm of the needle stopping when she looked up. The scarf was gone from the chair. Expecting someone? Maigret asked. No one, she said, but her eyes moved toward the window, as if expecting the view to disagree. A scarf, Maigret said, dark, with a stripe. Where is it? She hesitated, then bent to a drawer and took it out. It was folded neatly, as though awaiting a shop display. A client left it, she said. I keep it here in case he returns. Which client? Her gaze shifted to the half-finished dress on the form. Not one you could reach through a concierge, she said. Maigret took the scarf, feeling its weight in his hands. It was the kind of fabric that remembered the shape of the neck it had warmed. He placed it back on the table, not folded as she had, but spread the way a thing is when it has been claimed. When he comes for it, he said quietly, give it to him. And tell him the man with the cough is still looking. She said nothing, but her hands moved to the sewing machine again, the needle starting up as if the conversation had been no more than a pause for breath. On the stairs down, Lapointe said, "It's all threads, Chief." "But they're not in the same cloth yet." "They will be," Maigret said. "If you wait long enough, cloth comes together on its own. The trick is not to pull until it's ready." Outside, the air had shifted. There was the faintest smell of more snow in it. The street seemed to know it, the way people quickened their steps without quite knowing why. Maigret stood once more by the lamp-post, looking toward the alley beside number 14, his pipe in his hand, but unlit. Somewhere between the back door and the scarf was the reason the pale-eyed man had stood in the snow and not gone up. And between that and La Chaume was the kind of motive that was never evil for its own sake, but carried in the pocket, like something folded and unfolded until it wore thin. He was patient. The snow would come again. And with it, the kind of silence in which people tell you what you need to know without realizing they have said anything at all. The next morning, the snow returned as if it had been waiting just beyond the horizon for permission. By the time Maigret stepped outside, it was falling in large, patient flakes that seemed to weigh more than the day before, each one landing as though it knew precisely where it belonged. The air had that muffled quality he liked, the kind that made the city's noises sound as if they had been sent from far away. He did not go directly to Rue de Turenne. Instead, he walked along the quay, letting the river accompany him in silence, and stopped at a kiosk for the morning paper. He held it under his arm without unfolding it. The act of carrying it was enough. The headlines would be the same at midday, but the faces in the street would not. When he arrived near number 14, the street had been altered by the snow into something that seemed older. The wheel tracks were already blurring, the pavements narrowing under a white that did not yet show footprints. The lamppost stood like an unlit candle in the middle of this, the cough-man absent for now. The tobacconist's awning was bowed slightly under the weight, and behind his glass the man was arranging packets in neat rows, a task done for the sake of doing it rather than for need. Maigret crossed to the café opposite and took the same seat as before, his back to the wall, eyes on the doorway to number 14. The coffee came, hot enough to steam the window. He waited without looking at his watch. Waiting was the work. The rest came when it came. At 7:20, the first change in the stillness, a shadow under the tobacconist's awning, resolving into a man with his collar turned up. Not the pale-eyed one, not the cough, but someone unfamiliar. Tall, the build of a man who had carried sacks in his youth and still moved as if they were on his shoulders. He lit a cigarette, cupping it in both hands, though the snow was hardly a threat to the flame. His eyes kept straying toward number 14 in the manner of a man checking whether a door is still locked. 5 minutes later, the door opened. The woman with the perfume stepped out, her coat buttoned, a small parcel under one arm. She glanced up at the falling snow as if calculating how quickly it might undo whatever work she had done on her hair. The tall man flicked his cigarette into the gutter without taking a final pull and followed her, not close enough to suggest he meant her to know, not far enough to be by chance. They turned toward the boulevard, their figures thinning in the white. Maigret drained his cup and stepped out. The cold hit like a reminder rather than a shock. He crossed to number 14 and pushed the door open, the familiar smell of cabbage and soap reaching him at once. Madame Prévost was not in her loge. The chair behind the desk was empty, a folded newspaper lying on the seat as if holding her place. He climbed the stairs, each step carrying a faint echo that seemed softer for the snow outside. At the 3rd floor, Mademoiselle Hurette's door was ajar. He tapped with 2 fingers and heard her voice call for him to enter. She was at the window, not at her sewing machine, and turned only when he had stepped inside. "You're early again," she said, her tone halfway between curiosity and something like resignation. "You had a visitor," he said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "This morning?" "Number She left by the front door, Maigret said. Fair hair, perfume you can smell before the step creaks. Huret looked down at her hands, which were holding a spool of thread she had not been using. She brings work. She collects it, that's all. She left with a parcel. It was work, she said, but her voice thinned at the end. She likes to deliver things herself. Clients feel reassured when they see her face. And the scarf? He asked. It's still here, she said, nodding toward the chair. It was folded neatly again, exactly as the first time he had seen it. She didn't want it. She didn't ask, Huret said, and this time there was no effort to make the words convincing. Maigret stepped to the window. Through the veil of snow he could just make out the lamp-post, and beyond it the tobacconist still arranging his stock. No cough-man today. Not yet. You don't ask who the scarf belongs to? He said without turning. I sew hems, Inspector, she replied. Not stories. He faced her, his eyes steady. Sometimes they're the same thing. Downstairs, the loge was occupied again. Madame Prévost had a small pile of letters before her and was sorting them into the slots, her fingers quick despite their age. You missed your perfume, lady, he said. She didn't need me today, the concierge said without looking up. Some people prefer to pass quietly. She had someone following her, Maigret said. That's her affair, Madame Prévost replied, but there was the faintest lift in her voice that betrayed interest. Outside, the snow was thickening. Maigret stood at the corner, collar up, and waited. 20 minutes later, the cough man appeared from the opposite end of the street. He stopped at the lamp-post, his breath leaving brief clouds in the air. He did not look toward the alley this time. Instead, his eyes fixed on the door to number 14 as though expecting someone. Maigret crossed to him. She's gone, he said. The man's jaw tightened. I know. And you didn't follow? I follow who I need to, the man said, the cough coming a moment later, punctuating his words. You're looking for Lachaume, Maigret said. So is she, and so was the man with the polished shoes. The cough man's eyes slid toward him, measuring. Maybe we're all looking for the same thing. Maybe we're not. You're not looking for a scarf, Maigret said, but you might find it anyway. The man gave a dry, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. If I do, I'll know who it belonged to. And if I find Lachaume first? Maigret asked. The cough man shrugged, the motion almost lost under his coat. Then you can tell him I've been waiting. He'll understand the rest. Maigret left him there and walked slowly back toward the cafe. In his pocket, the matchbox felt heavier than it should have. The tobacconist had slipped it to him when he passed earlier, saying nothing. Inside, he opened it. 2 keys lay inside, identical except for the worn teeth on one. He knew without being told that one belonged to the obedient door of the service passage, the other perhaps to a flat that was no longer Lachaume's. He lit his pipe, letting the first draw sit in his lungs before releasing it. The snow was falling harder now, blurring the edges of the street, making movement slower, more deliberate. Somewhere behind the lace curtain of number 14's third-floor window, Huret might be at her sewing again, or she might be looking out, waiting for someone she would not admit to expecting. The scarf, the keys, the cough, they were pieces that fit, but not yet into a picture. He knew better than to force them. Some things had to settle into place on their own, like snow finding its way into every hollow and curve of the street, covering what had been there before without erasing it entirely. He would wait. The snow and the people who moved through it would do the rest. The tobacconist had not said a word when he pressed the matchbox into Maigret's palm, and Maigret had not asked then. He went back now, not because he expected an explanation, but because it is a courtesy between men who notice more than they say. The bell over the door gave its tired ring. Inside, the packets were arranged as if they had been born in their rows, and the man behind the counter was rubbing the rim of a small brass ashtray with a cloth until it shone like a coin no one would ever spend. "One of these," Maigret said, laying 2 francs on the counter and touching a packet without reading its name. "And the weather to go with it?" the tobacconist asked, folding paper around the packet as if he were dressing something. "It's improving only for those who like to see their breath," Maigret said. He held up the matchbox, opening it a fraction so the glint of metal showed, and then went away. The tobacconist kept polishing the ashtray for a second longer than necessary. "Found them under the corner of my mat when I came back from sweeping," he said, as if confessing to a small superstition. "No note. The street has a way of deciding what belongs to whom." "And you decided they belonged to me," Maigret said. "I decided you'd know what to do with doors," the man replied. He put the ashtray down squarely on its circle of clean counter. "One key is tired," he added. "The other is vain." "Tired?" Maigret asked, although he could imagine the teeth worn to consent. "It has opened itself too often," the tobacconist said. "The vain one is for a door that thinks it is important. A man makes a copy when he wishes to feel invited." "Who made this copy?" Maigret asked. "If you ask the locksmith on Rue du Parc Royal, he will remember nothing," the tobacconist said. "But he will look at you as if you remind him of his wife. Men remember something with their faces when they have promised their mouths not to." "Thank you," Maigret said. He tucked the matchbox away. "If the man with the cough comes back, he already has," the tobacconist said. "He bought nothing, stood as men stand when they are trying not to pace. He looked at the lamp-post as if it had ever answered anyone." Maigret left him with a nod and crossed into the thin fall of snow. He did not turn toward number 14 at once. He walked to the locksmith instead. The brass on. The shop's door had been polished by compulsion. The man who owned it had a mustache that seemed to have been combed with a ruler. He glanced up and showed the expression a man keeps for tax officials and policemen, a mixture of respect and the polite wish to be finished. Maigret placed the vain key on the counter. The locksmith took it up and weighed it the way a butcher weighs an unpromising cut. "Good brass," he said, as if that were a character reference. "New work in an old pattern." "You made it," Maigret said without making it an accusation. The locksmith looked at his mustache, decided it was in order, and then at the key again. "Many keys look like many other keys," he said. "And yet the hand that files leaves itself in the metal," Maigret said. "You have a way of finishing that puts a faint burr at the throat." The locksmith frowned, a man being flattered against his will. "If I did," he said cautiously, "it was because the gentleman asked for haste. Men with coughs are impatient." He did not give an address. He placed the original on the counter and looked at the door as if something were about to come through it. "Which original?" Maigret asked. The locksmith hesitated, then shrugged, not to agree but to give himself permission. He brought out a card box and produced a little bundle of offcuts, bits of metal with numbers scratched into them. He held the key against one and then another until he found a twin. "Type used in a building with a back passage," he said, "and the wear tells me the original belongs to a door that thinks itself less important than it is." "Number 12 or 14? Maigret asked. "I do not walk the Marais for pleasure," the locksmith said, but his glance slid toward the north. "If the gentleman with the cough returns, I will tell him that brass is hard to come by. It will slow his impatience." Back on the street, the snow was falling more lightly, as if it had lost interest. The lamp-post held a crown of white like an old man's forgotten hat. Maigret stood there long enough to become part of the scenery. A bus went past, and then another. Time in the city can be measured by buses as well as bells. He went at last to the obedient door in the corridor behind the loge. The tired key slipped in like a memory. The passage smelled of damp paper and the murk that lives between walls. He closed the door behind him and stood until his eyes belonged to the dimness. The courtyard of number 12 received him like someone who hadn't expected a guest and wasn't sorry. He crossed to the other door and tried the vain key. It turned with a faint brag, Beyond was a stair narrow enough to make men reconsider their waistlines. He climbed slowly, listening. At the second landing, a radio played a waltz without conviction. At the third, a door stood ajar. The number had been scrubbed away and written again on paper, pinned with a tack. Third floor, right, La Chaume's old flat. He knocked, the politeness of it for the building rather than for any occupant. No answer came, only the air of a place that had been lived in until it had absorbed enough to live on its own. He pushed the door. It opened as if expecting him. Inside, the rooms were tidy in the way of empty places, nothing out of place because there was no place left for things to be out of. He stood in the center, looking with his nose as much as his eyes. A faint scent of eucalyptus, old now, the ghost of a cough. The line on the wall where a calendar had hung and been removed lazily, leaving it square of unfaded paint. The mark of 2 chairs dragged together and then set apart again. On the table, a blister on the varnish where a cup too hot had been set down without thought. Beside it, a faint ring of sugar. In the bin, thread clippings the color of a dress he had seen pinned to a form. A blue somewhere between dusk and denial. He touched them. They stuck to his finger. Rooms keep things that people intend to carry away. He opened a drawer without hurry. Bills, a receipt from a shop that sold scarves, a little better than the customers it liked to pretend it had. In the wardrobe, a wire hanger bent at the shoulders, the kind that makes coats look more tired than men do. A strip of notepaper with a telephone number, without a name. He looked at the number the way a man looks at a face he might have seen in a crowd. He did not dial it. He folded the slip and put it in his pocket. There are conversations that should not be held when a room can still hear. On the floor under the window, the dust had a different pattern, a little V where someone had stood and then stood again, watching the courtyard. If a man were waiting for a sign from the opposite stair, he would watch there. The thought did not hurry. It went and sat somewhere, the way a dog takes a place by the stove and waits for the hand to remember it. When he came down, he met no one. In the corridor, the obedient door closed behind him with the gratitude of something returned to its habit. He stopped at the loge. Madame Prévost had made herself a cup of coffee in a glass and was letting the spoon rest, not because it had finished stirring, but because it had done enough for this morning. "You have keys for everything, Chief Inspector," she said, which was her way of saying she knew nothing and everything. "Only for doors that borrow themselves," he said. She glanced at the hooks. "People will be wanting names," she said with satisfaction. "I shall be asked all day whether I have seen this one or that. It will make me important without improving my health." "You will tell them you saw no one," Maigret said. "Of course," she replied. "And then I shall tell you who they were." He walked out into the street. The snow had turned to small, hesitant flakes. Lapointe was there before he was expected, the way young men arrive when they hope to have earned a nod, by guessing correctly. "Lognon telephoned," Lapointe said, falling into step without needing to be asked. In his gloomy fashion, "A complaint about your stealing cases by standing in front of them." "Lognon has the good sense to think every case is about to go wrong," Maigret said. "What does he want?" "He's been looking into the textiles firm where La Chaume kept his accounts," Lapointe said. 3 years of books tidy enough to make a saint suspicious. Money moved as if it had somewhere to be very quickly, and then decided it would rather be somewhere else. Names of clients who prefer curtains on their windows and their dealings. One of them is the fair-haired lady's employer. A woman who wears perfume that announces arrival is rarely the one who signs checks, Maigret said. She brings the paper. Someone else writes the numbers. "There's more," Lapointe said, as if reluctant to admit the story was growing bones. "The polished shoes man. We have a name. A watchmaker on Rue Vieille du Temple recognized the description and said he sold a strap to a fellow with pale eyes who couldn't stop checking the time. Name: Paul Huret." Maigret said, a sound without surprise. It was simply the noise he made when a piece wanted to be put where it had always belonged. Brothers are rare. Names are common, but sometimes they coincide. Lapointe looked at him. If he's kin to Mademoiselle, it would explain why a man does not go up when he has come so far, Maigret said mildly. A brother rehearses a reconciliation like a speech, and then the snow begins, and he finds he remembers only the opening line. They stood again by the lamp-post. The cough-man had not returned. The tall man who had followed the fair-haired woman had not returned either. The street was at that hour, when it pretends to be new for anyone who has only just woken. Maigret took out his pipe, then put it back unlit. A match makes a sound in a quiet morning that tells people you are thinking. "Shall we speak to Mademoiselle Huret about her brother?" Lapointe asked. "Not yet," Maigret said. "People tell you their relations when they have prepared the version they like. It is more useful to hear the version they do not intend." He crossed the street to the café and asked for the telephone again. He dialed the number from Lachaume's drawer, listened to the empty ring that sounded like a stairwell in a different building. On the fourth ring, a voice answered, male, tired, the sort of voice that had been taught to speak softly in rooms where walls are thin. "Hall?" it said. "Is this where money goes to wait for instructions?" Maigret asked pleasantly. A pause, then a cautious, "Who is this?" "A man who knows the back door of number 12, Maigret said. "Tell Monsieur Lachaume that I have his scarf, and that it has been among honest hands." "If I knew a monsieur by that name," the voice said, "I would tell him he had friends with unusual habits." "Then keep the habit," Maigret said, and hung up. He returned to the window seat, his coffee cooling, his gaze on number 14. He could feel, not think, the movement he had set in train, the small shift men make when they learn that an object that matters to them has been seen and recognized. Sometimes it is a watch, sometimes a photograph. A scarf is a good object. It carries warmth and scent and the memory of a neck. Men come back for scarves they have pretended to forget. In the street, the postman's whistle approached, slowed, and then stopped altogether. He had seen the cough man before Maigret did. The cough came first, counting itself. The man took his place under the lamp-post and did not look at anyone. He was waiting in that particular way that makes waiting obvious to those who have learned to see it. Maigret stood and did nothing. The building would speak before any of them. A window opened on the third floor, just a fraction, not enough for a face, enough for the smell of ironing to escape. A shadow moved behind the curtain and then was still. The fair-haired woman did not appear. The tall man did not return. The street seemed for a breath to hold itself in. When the door finally opened, it was not for any of them. A man stood there with a hat in his hand, as if to apologize to the weather. His eyes were pale in a way that made you think the world had been reflected there too often and had lost some of its color. His shoes, under the thin lace of new snow, were polished as if for a promise. He hesitated at the threshold, and then stepped in, not looking at the lamp-post, not looking at the café, not looking at the tobacconist, as if he could avoid a whole street by refusing to see its pieces. Maigret did not move. He let the door swing closed behind the man, and listened to the sound of it being caught by the spring, the soft click that in some buildings is called home and in others is called trap. The scarf on Huret's chair would be where she had left it. The keys in his pocket felt less like metal and more like sentences waiting to be spoken. Somewhere in Ivry, a woman had buttoned her cardigan wrong again. Somewhere, a locksmith was combing his moustache. Somewhere, a grocer was telling himself he had always been right. He sat down, patient, and let the snow finish a line on the pavement it had started yesterday and had left for today's hand. The city has its own way of writing things if you give it time, and people, most of all, will read themselves aloud if you keep very quiet. The pale-eyed man's arrival was like the turning of a page in a book no one had been sure was still being read. From his seat in the café, Maigret watched the door of number 14 swallow him. The cough man shifted under the lamp-post, but did not move to follow. His stillness was deliberate, the kind that says movement will come later, when it will matter more. Maigret sipped the last of his coffee, now lukewarm, and let a few minutes pass before rising. He crossed the street without looking directly at the doorway, but the sound of the hinge was still in his head, that half-sigh of an old door acknowledging a visitor it has met before. Inside, the hallway held the faint smell of wet wool. Madame Prévost was behind her desk, her glasses perched at the end of her nose, a pencil poised over a column in a small ledger. "Your guest has gone up," she said, without needing to be asked. "To Mademoiselle Huret?" "Where else?" She closed the ledger without making the sum she'd been about to write. He looked like a man expecting to be let in, and she looked as if she'd been expecting him since the snow began. Maigret took the stairs slowly. On the first landing, he heard a muffled sound from below, the bell on the street door. He paused, listening. A few seconds later, footsteps quick but careful came up behind him. He turned his head just enough to see the fair-haired woman with the perfume, carrying nothing this time, her gloved hand gliding over the banister as if it were a social grace rather than support. She glanced at him, the faintest lift at one corner of her mouth. "Inspector, we keep meeting here, don't we?" "It's a building that invites repetition," Maigret said, letting her pass. She went up without haste, though her heels made a sharper sound on the stone than the pale-eyed man's softer tread had. At the third floor, he stopped before Huret's door. It was closed, but not all the way. The latch not quite set. Voices came from within, low but distinct enough for him to separate them, a man's, tight and quick, and a woman's, Huret's, slower, with pauses that seemed to measure more than reply. Then another voice, the fair-haired woman's, cutting through with a tone that left no space for argument. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Footsteps, the creak of the window frame opening. For a moment, there was nothing but the muffled hush of snow filtering in. Then a quiet thud, as if something soft had been laid down rather than dropped. Maigret knocked, the voices stopped, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to consult glances. The door opened. Huret stood there, her hands empty, her face composed, but her eyes giving away the kind of strain that is easier to see than to name. "You're busy," he said, stepping past her without waiting for an answer. Inside, the pale-eyed man was by the window, his hat on the sill, snow melting in small beads along the brim. The fair-haired woman stood near the table, her gloves still on, the scarf folded between her hands, as if she'd been in the middle of deciding whether to offer it or hide it. "I see it's found its owner," Maigret said, looking at the scarf. The man's eyes flicked to it and then to Maigret. "It was mine," he said, not as a claim, but as a correction, as if the matter were settled by the word alone. "It was here," Maigret said, "long enough to become part of the furniture." The fair-haired woman's smile was small and tight. "You've been very attentive to Mademoiselle Huret's possessions, Inspector." "To what passes through her hands," Maigret said. "Possessions are just things. What people choose to keep is more revealing." The pale-eyed man stepped away from the window. "I didn't come for questions." "No," Maigret said. "You came for someone who might answer them without realizing. But you didn't go up the first time. You stood in the street. You folded a piece of paper as if it might tell you what to say, and then the snow began." "I wasn't ready," the man said, almost to himself. "You're her brother," Maigret said, and the air in the room seemed to notice. Huret's lips parted, but she didn't speak. The fair-haired woman's eyes went briefly to her before returning to Maigret's, calculating how much could be undone. "Paul Huret," Maigret went on, "a watch strap on Rue Vieille du Temple, pale eyes, shoes polished like an apology." The man's jaw moved, and for a moment it seemed he might deny it, but he only said, "I came to see if she was all right." "And to see Lachaume?" Maigret asked. Paul's gaze flickered. "I know the name." "He had your scarf," Maigret said, "or one exactly like it." and a key that doesn't belong to him. The fair-haired woman's voice cut in. "Inspector, you're circling something without saying it. What is it you think we've done?" "I think," Maigret said, "that Lachaume moved things for people who like their business quiet. Cloth, money, names. Sometimes through the front, sometimes the back. I think he knew both of you." His eyes shifted to Paul, "and that the man with the cough knows all three." Hurette's chair scraped as she stood. "Victor is in trouble, isn't he?" she asked, the first unguarded note in her voice since he had met her. "In trouble, or the cause of it," Maigret said. "Either way, it explains the footsteps in two directions when the snow should have shown only one." Paul's hands closed around the scarf, the fabric creasing under his grip. "If you know where he is, tell me." "If I did, I'd be there," Maigret said. "But I think he's closer than you imagine. People don't leave when they're waiting to see who's looking for them. They just change which door they use." The fair-haired woman slipped the gloves from her hands, finger by finger. "Then perhaps, Inspector, you'll tell us which door to watch." "I will," Maigret said, moving toward the window. "But not yet. I prefer to see who knocks first." He left them with that and went down the stairs. The hallway was empty except for Madame Prévost, who looked up from her ledger as if to ask whether she should mark anyone in or out. "Did anyone else come while I was upstairs?" he asked. She tapped her pencil against the paper. "The man with the cough. He stood in the doorway, saw your hat on the rack, and left without a word." Outside, the snow had eased to a fine dust, almost invisible until it caught the light. The lamppost was bare now. The cough man was nowhere in sight, but Maigret had the feeling he was close. Close enough to see who came and went. Close enough to know the scarf had changed hands. Lapointe was waiting near the café, his coat dusted white. "Anything?" he asked. "Not yet," Maigret said. "But the pieces are in the same room now. They'll arrange themselves soon enough." "And Lachaume?" "He'll come for something," Maigret said. "When he does, we'll see which door he trusts." He glanced up at the third-floor window. The curtain was still, but he thought he saw the faintest shift of shadow, as if someone had taken a step closer to watch him go. The street, quieter than it had been all morning, felt like a stage waiting for the next entrance. The snow would cover whatever needed covering, but not for long. And in that pause, between what is hidden and what is found, was where people told you the truth without meaning to. The street outside number 14 seemed almost to have settled back into its ordinary rhythm, but Maigret knew better. When people leave a room after a meeting that has not concluded, the air still carries the shape of what was left unsaid. He lingered by the café long enough to light his pipe and watch the windows across the way. Nothing moved. No face appeared. Yet he had the faint, unmistakable sense that every movement he made was being noted. Not just from Hurette's third-floor curtain, but from somewhere lower, perhaps behind a pane whose lace disguised more than it decorated. Lapointe shifted beside him, impatient in the way younger men were when they could not see what they were waiting for. "We can't just stand here forever, Chief," he said, his breath clouding in the cold. "No," Maigret said, drawing slowly on his pipe. "We stand here until someone else can't bear to." They did not have to wait long. At first it was only the soft opening of the door to number 14, but then the cough gave him away. That short, dry rasp counted out in 2s and 3s. The man stepped into the street, his collar high, his eyes scanning without resting. When he saw Maigret, he didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, he crossed toward them, each footstep placed as if testing the ground for traps. "You've been upstairs," he said, his voice flat. "And you've been deciding whether to go up," Maigret replied. "The scarf's been claimed." A flicker in the man's expression, not surprise, but a calculation altered. "By him?" "By the one it belonged to," Maigret said. "The same one you've been watching." The cough man looked past him toward the tobacconist's shop, though Maigret could tell his mind was upstairs. "If you see Lachaume before I do, tell him his time is running short." "That's a message you should deliver yourself," Maigret said. "It carries more weight from the man who coughs." The man's gaze hardened briefly, then he turned, walking away toward the alley that led to the service passage. Maigret watched him go, noting the careful way he avoided looking back, the kind of discipline that belonged to someone who had learned long ago not to invite a shadow to follow. "Shall we?" Lapointe asked, jerking his head toward the alley. "Not yet," Maigret said. "He's not going in. He just wants us to think he might." They went instead to the tobacconist, whose bell gave its weary jangle. The man behind the counter was refilling a jar of loose tobacco, the scent thick in the small space. "You've had more observers on your corner than a parade," Maigret said. The tobacconist's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "And fewer clowns. The one with the cough came in just now, bought a packet he didn't want, asked if the pale-eyed man was still upstairs." "And you told him?" "I told him he was too late for the scarf, but perhaps not for the rest." Maigret nodded, as if confirming a line in a notebook only he could see. "If either of them comes back, tell them you've seen me here every morning. That should make them hurry." Back in the street, the snow had stopped, leaving a thin skin of ice where slush had frozen. The air felt sharper, cleaner, as if the weather had decided to strip away pretense. Maigret crossed to number 14 again, this time going straight to the obedient door at the rear. It yielded to the key from the matchbox with the same quiet assent as before. The passage smelled different now, less of damp and more of something faintly acrid, as if a match had been struck not long ago. In the courtyard of number 12, the snow showed two sets of tracks, one leading out toward the lane, the other looping back to the stair he had just descended. Someone had been testing exits. He followed the loop to a door at the far end. The vein key turned there too, though with a little reluctance. Beyond was a narrow hall that led into a flat with its shutters closed tight. The air inside was stale, not quite the emptiness of abandonment, but the stillness of a place used between other places. Somewhere to stop, to wait, to think. On the table, a single coffee cup, its ring still wet. Maigret touched it lightly with the back of his hand. Warm. Whoever had been here had left within minutes. He went to the window and opened the shutter just enough to see the street. From this angle, the view caught both the door of number 14 and the lamp post. A perfect place for someone to watch without being seen. He closed the shutter again and stepped back into the hall. The floor carried a faint trail of wet from the courtyard, leading toward the opposite door. Whoever had used this place hadn't intended to stay or to be noticed. Back outside, Lapointe was waiting, his breath quick. "Hurette's door just opened," he said. "The fair-haired woman left, alone." "Which way?" "Toward the boulevard. I didn't follow. I thought—" "You thought right," Maigret said. "If she's alone, she's going to tell someone what happened. Better she doesn't see us." They waited by the corner until her figure had disappeared into the moving crowd. Then Maigret looked up again at the third-floor window. No movement now, no scarf on the chair. Inside, Madame Prévost was sweeping her step, the bristles catching on the uneven stone. She stopped when she saw him. "They'll be gone soon," she said. "One way or another. This building doesn't hold on to people who look over their shoulders too often." "Sometimes it's the shoulders that decide when to go," Maigret said. She gave a small laugh. "And sometimes it's the eyes behind the curtains." He left her to her sweeping and returned to the cafe. The chair he had been using felt as if it had been waiting for him. The proprietor brought him another coffee without asking. Maigret lit his pipe and let the minutes collect. Across the street, a figure appeared briefly at the alley mouth, looked toward the door of number 14, then withdrew. Not the cough man, not Paul Hurette. Someone taller, with the careful posture of a man trained to keep his weight evenly on both feet. Lapointe caught the movement too. "New player, or one we haven't seen in daylight," Maigret said. "They'll start showing themselves now. The snow has stopped. It's time for decisions." They watched in silence. The street filled and emptied again, each change of its rhythm another turn in the slow tightening of whatever held these people here. And Maigret, leaning back with his coffee cooling before him, knew they were nearly at the point where someone would have to choose which door they trusted most, and that would tell him everything. The tall, careful man did not reappear that hour, and the street made a show of pretending it had nothing more to give. A bus hissed past, leaving the smell of damp iron. A woman tugged a child in boots too new for the weather. The tobacconist rearranged the same two pyramids until even they seemed to tire of being pyramids. Maigret let his coffee cool to the point of truth and then stood, stretching the weight of his coat on his shoulders, as if to remind himself it was winter and not some dream of it. He did not go straight to the doorway. He crossed to the tobacconist instead and asked, quieter than a purchase, if a man were to come asking whether something small, say a scarf, had been left for him, and if one wished him to choose a particular door, which door would one direct him to? "The one that flatters his secrecy," the tobacconist said, not missing the movement of his paper knife. "The back that looks like a front to men who prefer backs." "Good," Maigret said. He put down coins he didn't owe. "If anyone asks after a scarf, tell him it's with the neighbor in number 12, top of the service stair." The bell muttered as he left. In the alley, the obedient door accepted the tired key with that small, grateful sound objects make when they are used for the purpose they understand. The passage of number 12 was cooler, as if the air there refused to be warmed by anything so personal as body heat. He climbed and let himself into the shuttered flat, where the cup had been left warm. It was only tepid now, but the saucer still had the soft ring of moisture where someone had set it down with the caution of fugitives and old men. He opened the shutter a fraction. From here he could see the lamp-post, the mouth of the alley, the sheen on the stone under the door of number 14 where snow had melted and refrozen. The city was holding its breath in the way it does not when men are noisy. Lapointe took up a place below in the alley's shadow, a dark comma at the edge of the sentence. They did not signal. They knew where the other was because the street knew. Time established its own pace, measured not by the clock, but by the shift in light, by the moment the tobacconist turned up his collar, by the way a dog circled twice before lying down in a doorway and decided instead to stand. After a while, footsteps came into the passage below, unhurried, pausing twice as if the walker had stopped to listen to his own thoughts, to see if they would change. The vain key turned in the lock with that small boast. The door opened, and Lachaume stood there with his hat in his hands, as if hats were apologies. He closed the door behind him without turning his head to look at it, which is the manner of men who have left many places they do not expect to enter again. His eyes were not pale like Paul Huret's. They had the color of paper left in a drawer and taken out too late. He saw the shape by the shutter and did not start. He only put the hat down on the chair back, carefully, like a man who uses care to make up for decisions he cannot. "You told the tobacconist," he said, the words arranged with the tidiness his books had once had. "I told the door," Maigret said. "He only carried the message." Lachaume stood with his hands at his sides. The coat he wore had been brushed, not pressed. It had a shine on the elbows that spoke of desks and leaning. A line of white at the seam of one sleeve showed where a thread had given up. "I meant to come sooner," he said. "The snow made cowards of us." "You had choices," Maigret said. "I had debts," Lachaume answered, and the word came without bitterness, like a fact about weather. "Not only money." He went to the table without being asked and sat. The chair made its small admission of weight. He was not a man who filled space. He occupied it the way pencil occupies a column, temporarily and with a view to being checked. Paul is upstairs, Maigret said. I know, Lachaume said. I waited until he went to her. He has a way of standing with his hat in his hands that makes women forgive him for bringing them trouble. And the woman with the perfume? She takes and brings, he said. She works for men who like to be seen not caring what is behind the curtain, and to whom it matters a great deal. The cough? Maigret asked. That one belongs to numbers, Lachaume said, and his mouth almost smiled at the fairness of it. He does not like numbers that move. He is sent when they do. They sat a while without speaking. From the street came the rip of a bus door opening, then closing. On the stair a step creaked that had creaked for 100 years at the same weight. Lachaume's hands lay quiet on the table, but the right thumb made a slow circuit of the left thumbnail, polishing nothing. You moved money, Maigret said, from those men to those curtains and back again. I kept their ledgers honest in appearance, he said, and when the firm folded, there remained a way to be useful to those who preferred their sums to be seen by only one pair of eyes at a time. And then a brother came, he said, and the word brother softened the room. He had the kind of mistakes that multiply when looked at. He owed to the cough. He thought if he could pay once, the cough would forget his address. He looked up then, not at Maigret, but at the shutter, as though it might answer. I loved a woman who did not know how to be loved by a man who files papers. I thought if I could arrive with something solved in my pocket, she might look up from her needle and see that I was in the room. Hourette, Maigret said. Yes, he said simply. I asked her to sew a lining heavier than necessary. I hid a small book there, a list of what would make men with perfume and coughs nervous, if not afraid. I told myself I held it only to keep them from pressing. I told myself many things men tell themselves when they begin with good reasons. She delivered that parcel this morning, Maigret said. She delivered one, he replied. There were two. The one she took away was ordinary, a curtain that keeps eyes out and lets the cold in. The other remained here until it could be useful or burned. And is it? Maigret asked. Lachaume reached into his coat and brought out something wrapped in brown paper, not much larger than a handkerchief. He set it on the table as if setting down a bird he had taught to sleep. It is only paper, he said, but it has the habit of turning into a rope if you throw it in the right direction. And your plan? Maigret asked. He did not touch the package. To trade it for time, Lachaume said. Time for Paul to leave the street where the cough walks. Time for her to go on sewing for people whose windows will be closed whether I am here or not. Perhaps time for me to stop being a man who carries his hat as an apology. It's a poor currency, Maigret said mildly. Time bought that way only knows how to stand outside doors. Perhaps, Lachaume said, and there was no fight in it. Footsteps came in the passage outside, then stopped at the wrong door and moved on to the right one, the way a man corrects himself without saying so aloud. The handle turned. The cough man entered without knocking, shutting the door behind him gently. The smell of eucalyptus arrived a second later, an escort for his chest. He saw the two of them in the package and did not change his face. I wondered which door you would trust, he said to Lachaume. Men always trust the one they have used before. You made a copy, Lachaume said, and the fact sounded almost like gratitude. It saved me a walk. The cough man's eyes went to Maigret, then back to the package. It is not a question of who takes it, he said, conversational. It is a question of how much noise it makes leaving the room. It needn't, Maigret said. It will, the cough man said. Noise has its uses. It makes an example of men who adjust ledgers with their thumbs. Your employers like quiet, Maigret replied. Quiet is their best advertisement. If the package leaves with your cough, it will speak all the way to the river. The cough man's fist closed once, as if catching his own chest. He did not answer that. He looked at the shutter, measuring angles, then at the door, and finally at Lachaume's hands. You could walk out with it, he said to Lachaume. You could try the lane. The snow remembers less today. It would amuse me to watch. I'm tired of lanes, Lachaume said. From the stair came another set of steps, lighter, then withheld, then resumed with an intention that had needed a breath to gather itself. The door opened without hurry this time. Paul Huret stood there, his hat in both hands, the scarf about his neck, the pale of his eyes colored by something that wasn't courage but would serve for it. He saw the package and did not reach for it. He looked at his sister's name where it would be written if it were written on air, and then at Lachaume, as if remembering a sentence he had rehearsed yesterday and could finish today. "It was my fault," he said. The words were so ordinary the room had to take a second to let them in. I owed what I could not pay. I told him if he could buy me 1 month, I would not need 2. I forgot that month's breed. The cough man smiled with half his mouth. Months breed best in rooms like these. They like shutters. "If I go with you," Paul said, turning to him, "do you leave the others alone?" The cough man shook his head, gentle, almost regretful. "That is not how trades are made. They are made in ways that make more trades." Paul nodded, as if that confirmed something he had known. He looked at Maigret then, and whatever he saw in the older man's face made a small sound in his chest that might have been relief and might have been surrender. "I didn't go up the first morning because I did not know how to be a brother the way a man is supposed to be," he said. "I thought if I stood long enough under the snow, a sentence would come to me that would do the job by itself." "Sentences rarely do," Maigret said. Outside in the alley, someone coughed who was not the cough man. Lapointe clearing winter from his throat. The building took note. Maigret put his hand flat on the table beside the package, not to claim it, but to tell it to wait. "You can all walk out of here today without noise," he said. "You," he looked at the cough man, "will tell your people that what they fear most has not been copied. It has, in fact, been badly kept by a man too soft to use it. You will tell them it has found its way to a drawer that belongs to the state, where it will be used only if someone insists on teaching me why I should not be patient." The cough man considered it. His eyes moved as if measuring the size of a word. "And what do I receive for making this poor report?" "You receive a street where your employers do not have to walk around police for a week," Maigret said. "You receive no deaths in stairwells. You receive the knowledge that I will not spend my mornings in their corners, so long as they prefer curtains to shouting." "And him?" The cough man tipped his chin toward Lachaume. "He will sign something that tells a small truth," Maigret said. "That he kept papers he should have burned, and that he feared men who carry numbers in their breath. The courts know what to do with such truths in winter. They make them short." The cough man's fist unclenched and closed again, a man weighing the eucalyptus he would need tomorrow. "You are too fond of quiet, Chief Inspector," he said. "One day it will make you deaf." "It has not yet," Maigret said. The cough man looked at Paul, and there was something like pity there, or maybe only recognition. "Don't owe what you cannot hide," he said, "or choose better sisters." Paul swallowed. "I will choose better months," he answered. It was almost an agreement. The cough man took a step back and then another, opened the door, and went out as if he had discovered that the room was smaller than he liked. His steps counted themselves down the stair. The air shed its eucalyptus slowly, as a room sheds someone who has used it too often. "I can give you the names," Lachaume said quietly, as if offering to carry a parcel for a neighbor. "I already have the names," Maigret said. He touched the package once, then pushed it lightly back toward Lachaume. "Burn it when I have finished with it, in a stove that has seen worse, and learn to be loved by the way you make coffee, not by the way you move columns." Lachaume's eyes shone briefly and went out. "That is a harder habit," he said. "Better than lanes," Maigret said, and stood. They left by the door that had bragged about its key. On the stair they met no one, which in a building like that meant everyone was listening. In the alley, Lapointe stepped forward with the look of a question he'd been saving. "Not yet," Maigret said. "We will speak to your gloomy friend Lognon and give him something to be right about. Then we will go home before the snow remembers us." They crossed to the street. The lamppost had lost its crown. In the cafe window, the proprietor was counting his glasses without looking at them. Across the way, behind lace that had learned the trick of indifference, a curtain moved the smallest amount and then decided to have never moved at all. The day had reached that hour when light thinks of leaving and then, out of courtesy, stays a little longer. "Your wife will have made a stew," Lapointe said, trying the air with an optimism he did not quite own. "She will," Maigret said, and felt the truth of it go down into his bones like heat. He drew on his pipe and didn't mind that it had gone out. The street began to sound like itself again. Somewhere, a radio learned the tune of the evening, and in a shuttered room behind a back door that fancied itself important, a small parcel of paper sat on a table like a sleeping bird, waiting to decide what sort of morning it would wake into. The day after, the snow melted into the grey skin of the city, losing the sharp outlines that had given it its voice. By mid-morning, the gutters were running with thin water the colour of old tea, and the smell of wet stone replaced the clean cold of the previous days. Maigret arrived later than usual at the Quai des Orfèvres, coat damp at the hem, the package from La Chaume already filed away in a locked drawer whose key he kept with the same absent-minded care as his pipe. There had been no more visits to Rue de Touraine. The cough man had not reappeared, and Madame Prévost, when Lapointe checked in, had reported a stretch of days so ordinary that she almost missed the intrigue. Paul Huret had vanished into that part of the city where men are neither hiding nor entirely gone, and Mademoiselle Huret had returned to her sewing, the hum of her machine as steady as if it had never been interrupted. La Chaume's statement lay typed on Maigret's desk, 3 short paragraphs that said little but said it plainly. Enough to satisfy the record without inviting anyone to look too closely. In a week, he would appear in court, receive a penalty as mild as the charge allowed, and disappears into some quieter part of the city. Whether he would keep to himself after that was not Maigret's business, nor his bet. By late afternoon, the sky over Paris was the colour of unwashed wool, and Maigret felt the case had already begun to sink into that part of memory reserved for episodes that end without shouting. He had no doubt that the people in it, the fair-haired woman, the cough man, even the tall figure seen once and never again, would go on circling each other, the way certain names reappear in ledgers and certain faces in doorways. The package had simply changed hands in a way that left no marks worth following. He left the office earlier than usual, walking the quay with the river on his left, the lamps beginning to glow in the mist. The city smelled of coal smoke and thawing snow, a scent that always made him think of kitchens. When he reached home, Madame Maigret was in the dining room, laying out the evening meal. She looked up from the table, her expression the same quiet welcome that belonged to her and no one else. "You're early," she said. "It was a day for finishing early," he replied, taking off his coat and hanging it to dry. Over dinner she asked nothing about his work. She never did unless he brought it up. And he found himself speaking instead of the weather, of the postman who whistled out of tune, of a tobacconist with a taste for symmetry. The case stayed where it belonged, behind him, its edges already softening. Later, in his armchair, pipe lit, Maigret let his thoughts return briefly to the snow-covered street, the lamp-post, the door of number 14. The people there had moved according to their own logic, driven by debts, by loyalty, by the need to keep something, a scarf, a name, a piece of paper, within reach. None of them were villains in the way the word is usually meant. They were only people, carrying their burdens through the cold, making choices that seemed smaller than they were. He drew in the smoke, tasting it as it cooled, and thought of how the snow had covered everything at first, hiding the lines between one step and the next, and how, as it melted, those lines returned, faint, perhaps, but still there for anyone patient enough to read them. Then he let the thought go, the way the river let go of the city's reflection, and sat in the quiet while the evening settled fully in, 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 settled fully in,